So I've just been watching a documentary, Ross Kemp's Extreme World, and this particular episode was on Glasgow. I'm actually visiting Glasgow tomorrow. I live in Sunderland in North East England, but I'm a Celt. I'm from Northern Ireland originally, and I'm visiting Glasgow tomorrow, just a day trip. So I tend to do this when I visit places. I tend to kind of watch things that are connected with wherever I'm going. Anyway, firstly, I want to say Ross Kemp is a journalist I have a lot of respect for. I think he's professional, I think he's brave, I think he's overall getting a good impression from the man, and I have to say a lot better than his ex-wife Rebecca Brooks, former editor of The Sun. Anyway, this was a very interesting documentary. It raised the sort of premise that he was taking with it was poverty in the United Kingdom. And Glasgow has some of the worst poverty in this country. It's some of the grimmest scenes in Western Europe, in all honesty. And there's parts of Glasgow where the situation is so bad that life expectancy for some men in Glasgow is 54. You heard that right, 54. That's even lower than some developing countries. It's a truly awful statistic. As expected, this was quite a heavy documentary. By the way, I should introduce a bit to my international viewers. If you don't know, Glasgow is a big city in Scotland. It's the biggest city in Scotland, actually. It's the third largest city of the United Kingdom. It was known once as the second city of the British Empire. It had a leading role in the Scottish Enlightenment. In fact, in the 1820s, it was known as quite a handsome city, quite an attractive city. But throughout the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, well, a good deal of the 20th century, Glasgow suffered some severe social problems. Most British cities did, but Glasgow, they were especially bad. Places like the Gorbals, for example, there was tenement buildings with severe crime, poverty. Some things in that city are hard to comprehend in one of the world's biggest economies. So this documentary, some of the stuff I found shocking, but not that surprising. I mean, it wasn't. I've seen similar documentaries before, but this was a particularly good one. But basically, in the UK, Glasgow has always sort of been a byword for a rough city. It's sort of it's a tough place. There's no question about that. It always has been and always will be. It's a tough city, and it's part of Glaswegian culture. It's also a very proud city, but it's a city that's very it's like many places. There's two Glasgows really. On one hand, you have the Glasgow that won the European Capital of Culture in 1990, a thriving big city with nightclubs, with museums. It's a cosmopolitan place, free universities. It's like any other big cosmopolitan city. On the other hand, you have the Glasgow, which is almost a stereotype Glasgow, which is drugs, crime, and some poverty that you can't imagine. There were some things that struck me in the documentary. One of the things that Ross Kemp said, and I do trust him, he's a reporter that does his research, is that there's 10,000 homeless people in Glasgow. 10,000. Now, to put that in context, Glasgow has a total population these days of about, in the city council area, 590,000. I don't know if that 10,000 figure is for the whole Greater Glasgow area, which includes towns like Rutherglen, Cambuslang, Bearsden. The total Glasgow conurbation is about 1.5 million. The city has actually declined in population significantly, but 10,000 people is a staggering statistic. To put that in context, I think that's by far the highest in the United Kingdom. I think it's higher even than London. It's a staggering statistic. 10,000 homeless people in Glasgow. Now, in the UK, homeless has several definitions. It doesn't necessarily mean people sleeping rough. I believe the statistic for that was 4,000. But it can also mean people who are vulnerably housed, like they surf from one house to another, they're in sheltered accommodation. So homeless covers a wide range of definitions. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Glasgow is a city with some severe social problems. I don't want to speak in detail about this, but I do want to touch on a few things that were raised in this documentary. One thing I would say is that there's absolutely no way you can encompass all the problems in a 42-minute documentary. I think really these are complex problems, and anyone that thinks they're black and white is deluded. They're not black and white. They're complex problems. He was focusing on poverty, so inevitably the subject of welfare came up. A lot of the people he interviewed in the program were claimants, welfare dependent, but he really hit the nail on the head as to why the welfare system is not as black and white as people think it is. I've personally been through it, although thank goodness I've never had to deal with some of the shit that these people have had to go through. I mean, some of the stories are really hard to comprehend. There was one woman who was fed heroin from the age of 9. There was a guy who was drug dealing from the age of 12. Things like this, just staggering things. Another man who was obviously a chronic alcoholic. He believed that he would die soon. This was filmed, I believe, this year. He cut off 2 of his own toes. Just things that are really staggering. And I'm not saying Glasgow is unique. No doubt you'd find similar situations in Detroit and cities all over the world, but it's in Glasgow it is a particularly bad problem. But anyway, Ross Kemp was sort of speaking from an outside perspective, and there was a few points I could tell he was trying hard not to be judgmental and sort of trying hard to play the devil's advocate with these people, because what he was arguing was in many cases they are in a trap. And there's one very interesting point where he interviews a guy, and sort of the guy is making the point that the way things are, to get into a paid job life would not be any easier than as it is at the moment. So the welfare system actually it puts people in an unwinnable position the way it is. Part of the problem, I know what he's talking about because I've personally experienced this. For example, if you're claiming JSA and you're claiming it for a certain length of time, then you're put onto a work program. Now, if you actively seek work during that work program, for example, if you go for a job interview and you don't turn up to the work program, you'll be penalised for that. Then, if you don't get the job, then you're in an impossible situation. Firstly, I've made my position on workfare very clear. I think workfare is an abomination, and I would say that to anyone. I don't think people should be forced to work for no money. So a lot of the discussion about the welfare state is that these people get free money, but they don't realise that part of the welfare system is workfare. Now, if you know anything about that program, it's a total abomination, and I don't believe it is designed to help people. I believe it is designed as punishment. Of course, ministers will deny that, and so will companies that are making profit from it, but there's certain things that go on behind closed doors that the wider public really don't realise. Now, I think a lot of important issues are raised. There's no doubt about it. A lot of these people have serious problems, alcohol problems, drug problems. In the case of women, prostitution issues. There's a lot of issues that these people have. But I think it would be wrong to be so judgmental of their situation, because my question to people who are sort of looking at them and saying, well, these people, why should they get any money from the state? If you were force-fed heroin from the age of 9, do you really think that you would handle life any better? These are human beings we're talking about, and they have done some unsavoury things. I'm not a namby-pamby liberal when it comes to crime, so I'm sure some of these people are no saints. I'm sure they've done some pretty unpleasant things in their life, and I've always been conservative on crime. On welfare, I'm a bit more to the left. Now, I don't think that's a contradiction. I don't think it's a contradiction to say that if someone commits crime, they should face penalties for that, consequences for that. But if people are, and basically I more or less agree with Ross Kemp with a lot of his philosophy on it. Clearly, it's not good to have a system whereby you're just sort of helping people or giving them financial support, but not sort of encouraging them to take responsibility. Obviously, responsibility is a key factor, but I absolutely despise the tabloid approach, which is basically just vilify them. I mean, the tabloid approach, which was led by people like Ross Kemp's ex-wife, is basically just demonise these people, call them scroungers, call them scumbags, plaster that all over the cover of the Sun or the Express or any other hideous rag, and turn the wider public against them. But the problem with that is it just completely ignores some of the issues that these people face. Now, of course, there's people that abuse the system and they know that they're doing it, but there's some very complicated, complex issues that are not going to be addressed by just slandering these people and criminalising them. Now, it is true a lot of them have a criminal record, but not everyone that claims welfare is a criminal. I wasn't, and I know there's a lot of people who do it because they are in a position where they have no other choice. Now, I have not had to deal with some of the situations that these people have. I have a loving family. I'm very fortunate compared to some of the people in that documentary, and I am grateful every single day that I have a roof over my head. I can't think of few things in this world worse than being homeless, especially in a otherwise prosperous country. Ross Kemp makes a point towards the end of the documentary. He says there'll be people watching this program who think these people deserve it. I'm of the opinion that no human being should be living like this, and I agree with Ross Kemp. Now, I'm not of the sort of view that some people on the left have, that it's all the fault of the government. There are people out there who would say, oh, it's all the fault of Margaret Thatcher. I think that you can't go down that line, because the problem with that is if you take away all responsibility from people, then that will always be used as an excuse. Now, there's no question about it, economic policies have a factor, and when the government closes down social programs, when they close down youth clubs, this sort of thing, obviously it's going to have a wider impact. But there is also choices to be made, and there's people, it's a very difficult one, because on one hand you're judging the fact that these people have dealt with situations that many of us can't imagine. I mean, I keep going back to that case about the girl who was force-fed heroin from the age of 9. A lot of the people who would judge her have never, basically she was a victim of child abuse. Now, what is someone in that situation? It's all very well to talk about responsibility, but she was a 9-year-old girl. What choice did she have? So I believe, yes, there needs to be responsibility, but there needs to be some compassion for the people on the margins of society. And what I despise about the current government is I mean, it wasn't long ago that the Tories I was going to make a separate video about that, but they actually had spikes in Westminster City Council to deter homeless people from sleeping rough. That just shows how callous and cold-blooded this government is, or at least most of it. I believe the Liberal Democrat side is more compassionate, and to the Liberal Democrats' credit, I believe they are trying their level best to be the more compassionate side of the government. But the Tories, I refuse to believe that they have much compassion. I believe the Conservatives are a party that basically think if you're homeless it's your own fault, so we're going to punish you. I mean, why else would you explain that they're taking money away from vital schemes for these people? And it's just, you know, the government will talk about they're investing millions of pounds into youth training and this sort of thing, but what they're not saying is they are also basically treating you like if you're unemployed you're a criminal. This sort of scapegoating isn't the answer. Now, okay, not stupid, there are people claiming welfare who are criminals, who've had a criminal record, but that in itself is problematic, because someone who's done their time, okay, they might not be a saint, but if they've done their time, they've done their time. Now, that person is in a very hard position, because if they're honest on their CV and say, yeah, I've been in prison, most employers understandably are going to be reluctant about employing them. But the problem is they can't win, because if they're honest, employers won't employ them, and if they're not honest, and then the employer finds it out, then the employer will think, oh, they're lying to me. So what can someone who has done time do? In other words, the job market is very, very restricted, so I think there needs to be some incentives for employers who are willing to take those people on. I do understand the employer's perspective. I mean, If I was an employer, I would be reluctant to take someone who's been an ex-thief, unless I'm absolutely convinced that they've reformed. That's understandable. So there's a lot of issues to address, but I am convinced that the tabloid approach, which is basically to just demonise these people and plaster headlines, which by the way are often based on distortion, is also the wrong approach. And a lot of the things that are basically said about the welfare state are not quite accurate. It's not quite true that people are just throwing, given free money. There are a lot of obligations to it, but the problem is some of those obligations are pointless. I mean, nowadays I'm very close to signing off, even though I'm not exactly in a position to do that. The reason is because I was told by my advisor the last time I signed on, okay Nathan, you need to put on your application. In fact, I'll show you if I have the copy. Okay, so every time you turn up at the job centre, you need to show them this booklet, and you have to do it online as well. You need to write what you're doing to actively find work, and if you have copies of the applications and so on, you need to show them that. The problem is now they're telling me I need to expand what I'm looking for. I'm a qualified English teacher, so I'm trying to find something more sustainable in the UK rather than always going abroad. So that is the area I'm looking at. It's a field that I'm experienced in. What they're saying is you need to show that you're looking for other types of work. Well, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to apply for anything where there is one area I'm avoiding, that is the catering industry. The reason I'm avoiding it is because I've had very bad experience with corrupt managers. Now, I make no apologies to anyone for doing that. Some people will say, oh, you're a slacker, why aren't you taking anything that comes? I would turn that around and say, well, if you've worked in a restaurant and you've had to deal with a corrupt manager who didn't pay you properly, would you take that sort of job if you've done it 3 times? So people can't accuse me of not trying. And I'm not trying to make this personal, I'm just saying, if this is the sort of challenge that I face, and I'm not someone who's had a drug problem or an alcohol problem or a homeless problem, or a sex trade problem, if those are the sort of barriers I am facing, what is it going to be like for someone with a much more complicated background? So the system, of course it should encourage responsibility, but I don't believe that it should be just about punishing people. And I believe what is happening is the government is under pressure by their own voters, i.e. by conservative voters, to make it look like they're being tough. And the reason is because the evil tabloids are scapegoating and vilifying these people. The problem is that poverty is not a black and white situation. Now, it's not all bad. There's some things that was raised in the documentary that may well need to be encouraged. For example, towards the end, Ross Kemp mentioned supported accommodation. That apparently has reduced homelessness in those schemes by 60%. That's a success, or at least a relative success. So maybe that's something that needs to be encouraged a lot more. The bottom line is, none of these issues are black and white, and simply demonising claimants is not the answer. I'm not stupid. I know there are people who abuse the system, and it's entirely valid to criticise those people, but it's not as black and white as people think. If you've been through the system, you'll know what I'm talking about. So there's people out there who have been fortunate enough to have stable work their whole lives, and they're very sort of judgmental, and they look down on everyone else who's been through the system. Oh, they're criminals, they're slackers, they're scroungers. The truth is, unless you've been through the system, you really don't know what it's like, and you don't know the sort of challenges that unemployed people face. I have always said that unemployed people have responsibility, and I'm certainly trying to find work myself, but the issues are not black and white. They're just not. And I think the system should encourage responsibility, but at the same time, it shouldn't be designed to scapegoat the unemployed and punish them. Workfare is basically punishment. No matter, the government will say it's designed to help people back into work, but if that's the case, then why is it that these workfare schemes, claimants are spoken to like they're criminals? If you look at the sort of contract, it's entirely one-sided. Entirely one-sided. The system is deeply flawed, but not necessarily because it's too soft on claimants, partly because it scapegoats claimants. So I'll put a link to the documentary and let you decide yourself, but I think it reveals a lot of interesting things.